October 20th, 1968. The rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy province shimmer under a half moon. 5 Australian SAS troopers crouch motionless, 200 meters from a Viet Cong supply track. No Huey overhead, no gunship on standby. Just silence and the distant rustle of enemy boots. At nearby fire bases, American units won't move without air cover, gunships, artillery, the full metal orchestra. That's how you survive Vietnam. That's what doctrine demands. But Major Roberts watches 60 Viet Cong fighters pass within spitting distance and makes a decision that breaks every rule. He keys his radio once. Waits. Then leads his patrol into the black jungle at midnight, hunting ghosts with nothing but patience and steel. The smallest force in Vietnam is about to prove the biggest lesson. Sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't what you bring to the fight, it's what you leave behind. The jungle breathed around them in the pre-dawn darkness of October 21st. Major Roberts pressed his back against the smooth bark of a rubber tree, counting heartbeats as the last Viet Cong fighter disappeared into the undergrowth. 60 enemy soldiers had passed within rifle range, close enough to smell the fish sauce on their evening rations, close enough to hear the soft clink of equipment against webbing. His 4-man patrol, call sign Phantom 1, had remained frozen for 27 minutes, watching through starlight scopes as the column moved supplies toward the eastern ridgeline. Roberts keyed his radio twice, paused, then keyed it once more. The coded signal meant contact confirmed, enemy strength assessed, proceeding as planned. No coordinates, no request for immediate fire support, no scramble order for gunships at Nui Dat base camp 12 kilometers southeast. Lieutenant Collins, crouched 3 meters to his left, raised an eyebrow in the green glow of night vision. Every other unit in Phuoc Tuy province would have called in the full metal orchestra by now, Cobra gunships, artillery from the 161 battery, maybe even a spooky gunship with its side-firing miniguns. But Roberts had spent 72 hours in this jungle without resupply, moving at 800 meters per hour through terrain that swallowed sound like a sponge. He knew something the conventional forces did not. At night, the Hueys betrayed you long before they helped you. The thump of rotor blades carried for 3 kilometers in the still air. Engine whine echoed off the ridgelines. Even the radio chatter between pilot and ground control gave away patrol positions to any Viet Cong monitor with a captured AN/PRC 25 radio. The patrol had inserted at 2300 hours 3 nights ago, rappelling from a single Huey onto a landing zone 8 kilometers north of their current position. Standard 5-man LRRP configuration. Each soldier carried 40 kilograms of equipment, including 10 days of rations, 200 rounds of 7.62 ammunition, and enough water for a week in the humid lowlands. They moved only at night, cutting sign during daylight from carefully concealed observation posts, navigating by compass and terrain association through rubber plantations that stretched toward the Cambodian border. Roberts checked his watch. 0130 hours. The Viet Cong column would reach their base camp within 2 hours, unload supplies, and disperse before dawn. Perfect timing for what came next. He tapped Collins on the shoulder, then signaled the other 3 patrol members with hand gestures that meant prepare for movement. They would shadow the enemy column for 1 kilometer, establish an ambush site along the return route, and wait until the supply bearers came back empty-handed and careless. The doctrine manual said to call for air support the moment you made contact with a force larger than squad size. The training cadre at Kanungra had hammered that lesson home during jungle warfare school in Queensland. Superior firepower meant superior survival rates, but Roberts had run the numbers himself during previous patrols. Gunship response time in this terrain averaged 18 minutes from initial call to first rounds on target. Artillery took 12 minutes but required spotting rounds that announced your position to every enemy fighter within a 5-kilometer radius. By the time the heavy support arrived, a smart enemy had either melted away into the jungle or repositioned for a counter-ambush. The patrol moved in single file, Roberts on point, maintaining intervals of 10 meters between each man. They crossed a shallow stream at 0200 hours, stepping on rocks to avoid leaving boot prints in the muddy bank. The enemy trail wound southeast through a gap between 2 hills, following the path of least resistance toward what intelligence reports identified as a regimental supply depot. Perfect terrain for a patience-based ambush. Roberts selected the kill zone at 0240 hours, a natural bottleneck where the trail curved around a fallen mahogany tree, forcing foot traffic into a narrow corridor 15 meters long. Collins and 2 other patrol members positioned MO-18A1 claymore mines at chest height, angled downward to maximize the lethal radius of the 700 steel ball bearings packed into each device. Tripwires stretched across the trail at ankle height, nearly invisible in the darkness. Roberts and the 5th patrol member established overwatch positions 30 meters upslope, providing security and escape routes. They waited. No radio chatter, no cigarettes, no movement except the slow shift of weight from one knee to the other every 20 minutes to prevent muscle cramps. The jungle settled around them with the sounds of night hunters, fruit bats in the canopy, the distant call of a barking deer, the rustle of something large moving through bamboo thickets down slope. Roberts had learned to distinguish between natural jungle sounds and human movement during his first tour with 2nd Squadron SASR. Tonight, the forest told him they remained undetected. At 0415 hours, the first enemy soldier appeared on the trail, then 5 more, then a dozen. The return column moved faster than expected, lighter without their supply loads, talking in low voices that carried clearly in the still air. Roberts counted 19 fighters as they approached the kill zone. He waited until the lead element reached the tripwire, then watched the night explode in orange flame and steel. The ambush lasted 47 seconds. When the firing stopped, 17 Viet Cong lay dead or wounded in the corridor. Roberts signaled immediate withdrawal. The patrol collected weapons and documents, treated 2 wounded prisoners with field dressings, then began the 4.4-kilometer movement back to their extraction point. They reached the landing zone at 0630 hours as the first Huey appeared on the horizon, rotors beating against the morning mist. Back at Nui Dat Base Camp 6 hours later, Roberts faced the inevitable questions from Colonel Anderson, the task force operations officer. Why no gunship support during target acquisition? Why risk a ground ambush instead of calling in artillery? Why operate without immediate backup when doctrine clearly specified air cover for all patrol activities beyond company perimeter? Roberts set down his after-action report and looked up at the operations tent map, marked with helicopter flight paths and artillery fire zones that covered Phuoc Tuy Province like a grid of American firepower. Roberts spread the terrain map across the briefing table and traced his finger along the ridgeline east of Nui Dat. The horseshoe area had earned its name from the distinctive curve of hills that formed a natural amphitheater 9 kilometers from base camp. Intelligence reports indicated heavy Viet Cong activity along the northern approaches, but conventional patrols had failed to make contact despite 3 weeks of helicopter insertions and search-and-destroy sweeps. Too much noise, Roberts thought. Too much predictable movement during daylight hours when the enemy could hear them coming from 5 kilometers away. The August heat pressed down like a wet blanket as Roberts briefed his patrol on the night insertion. They would move at 2300 hours, insert via single Huey drop at a landing zone 2 kilometers south of the target area, then proceed on foot to establish an observation post overlooking the main infiltration routes. No gunship escort, no artillery on standby, just 5 men with 10 days of rations and enough patience to wait for the enemy to reveal themselves. Lieutenant Collins checked his equipment for the 3rd time, running through the LRRP checklist that had become second nature during training at Kanungra and Papua New Guinea. 40 kilograms of gear including water, ammunition, radio, batteries, and the starlight scope that would give them decisive advantage in night operations. The AN/PVS-2 night vision device multiplied available light by 40,000 times, turning moonless jungle into a green-tinted landscape where human movement showed up like searchlights. The insertion went clean. The Huey pilot held his approach angle low and fast, flaring hard at the last second to drop the patrol onto a cleared patch between rubber trees. Rotor noise echoed off the hills for 30 seconds after departure, then faded into the normal symphony of jungle night sounds. Roberts waited 5 minutes before signaling movement, listening for any indication that enemy forces had detected the helicopter insertion. Nothing but fruit bats and the distant call of a nightbird somewhere in the canopy above. They moved northeast at 0.5 kilometers per hour, following a compass bearing that would take them around the western slope of Hill 873. The terrain rose steadily through secondary jungle growth, forcing them to navigate around fallen trees and bamboo thickets that could snap underfoot and betray their position. Roberts had calculated the movement carefully, 2.3 kilometers of undulating ground that would require 4 hours to cross without leaving sign or making unnecessary noise. At 0200 hours, they reached the ridge crest at 800 feet elevation. The observation post overlooked a valley that stretched toward the Cambodian border, intersected by 3 main trails used for supply movement from base areas across the frontier. Roberts positioned his patrol in a defensive arc, 30 meters below the military crest, digging shallow scrapes behind a fallen log that provided natural camouflage. The starlight scope revealed details invisible to naked eye observation, footpaths worn smooth by years of foot traffic, fighting positions carved into hillsides, even the glint of metal from equipment cached in the jungle below. Dawn brought the first revelation. Through binoculars, Roberts counted 47 enemy soldiers moving in single file along the main trail, carrying supplies north toward what appeared to be a regimental headquarters. The column moved with tactical discipline, maintaining intervals, posting flank security, varying their route to avoid predictable patterns. This was no ragtag guerrilla force, but a well-trained unit conducting military operations according to sound tactical principles. Roberts keyed his radio and transmitted a 3-line situation report to Nui Dot Base Camp. Ma Rung moving, grid 297415. 47 personnel observed, northbound movement, heavy packs. The coded transmission took 12 seconds. No request for immediate fire support, no call for helicopter reinforcement, just information that would allow higher command to track enemy movement patterns without compromising the observation post. The second day brought more intelligence. A Viet Cong battalion, nearly 300 fighters, used the valley as a rest area during daylight hours before continuing movement after sunset. Roberts observed supply caches, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a field hospital treating wounded from recent operations. The enemy felt secure enough to cook rice in the open, post minimal security, and allow their fighters to rest without full tactical alertness. Colonel Anderson's voice crackled over the radio during the scheduled communication window at 1800 hours. Phantom 1, we have gunships available for immediate strike mission. Provide target coordinates for fire support. Roberts looked through the starlight scope at the enemy positions below. 300 men concentrated in terrain that would channel them into perfect killing zones for aerial attack. Standard doctrine called for maximum application of firepower against lucrative targets. Roberts depressed the radio transmit key and delivered his response that would define everything that followed. Negative on immediate strike. Enemy unaware of observation. Request permission to maintain surveillance and conduct ambush operations at time and place of our choosing. The radio fell silent for nearly a minute before Anderson's acknowledgement came back. Permission granted for autonomous operations, but with the understanding that Roberts would bear responsibility for results. That night at 0400 hours, the ambush began. Roberts had positioned his patrol along a trail junction where 3 paths converged near a stream crossing. The enemy moved in column formation, confident in their security because no helicopters had been heard in the area for 72 hours. M18. A-1 Claymore mines detonated simultaneously as the lead element entered the kill zone, followed by concentrated rifle fire from concealed positions upslope. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, Roberts counted 23 enemy dead and 8 wounded prisoners who provided valuable intelligence about unit designations and future operations. The patrol exfiltrated on foot, moving 4.4 kilometers to a pre-planned extraction site where a single Huey waited with engines turning. Total ammunition expenditure, 112 rounds of small arms fire and 3 Claymore mines. The contrast became clear during the debrief at Nui Dot. On the same night, a U.S. infantry platoon in a different sector had conducted a helicopter assault against a suspected enemy position 12 kilometers to the west. 2 OH-6 Loach helicopters and 4 Huey gunships had inserted the assault force after preliminary bombardment by 18 rounds of 155mm artillery. The operation fired 1,500 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition and called in additional fire support from Cobra gunships armed with 2.75-inch rockets. Results: 12 Viet Cong contacted, 2 confirmed kills, 7 wounded. The enemy had detected the helicopter assault during its approach and withdrawn the majority of their force before the Americans reached the objective. Cost in ammunition, fuel, and flight hours: 10 times the expenditure of Roberts's night ambush for 1/10 the tactical effect. The success spread through 2nd Squadron SASR like wildfire through dry grass. By November of 1969, Roberts found himself briefing patrol leaders from 3 different companies on night insertion techniques. The after-action reports painted a picture that challenged everything conventional forces believed about Vietnam operations. Night insertion reduced enemy detection signatures by 87% compared to daylight helicopter assaults. Silent movement allowed patrols to operate within 200 meters of enemy positions without compromise. Most importantly, the absence of gunship noise meant enemy forces continued normal activities, revealing supply routes, command posts, and movement patterns that helicopter operations scattered to the winds. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, commanding officer of 2nd Squadron, stood before the operations map at Nui Dat and pointed to sectors that had been considered too dangerous for extended patrol operations. "Roberts, I want you to take this concept north. Long Con Province, the area around Black Horse Base Camp, has been giving our American allies fits for 6 months. Multiple battalion-sized enemy units moving supplies from Cambodia. Every time they send helicopters to investigate, the jungle goes quiet." Roberts studied the terrain features on the 1 to 50,000 scale map. Long Con presented different challenges than the rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy. Primary jungle growth with triple canopy that blocked starlight. Stream networks that channeled sound in unpredictable directions. Most significantly, enemy forces had been fighting conventional units in this area for months, learning to anticipate helicopter insertions and respond with coordinated counterattacks. The expanded area of operations extended Australian responsibility 4 kilometers across the provincial border, encompassing terrain that intelligence estimated contained 2 full Viet Cong regiments and supporting logistics elements. Roberts would insert his patrol into what amounted to an enemy stronghold, operating without the gunship umbrella that every other Allied unit considered essential for survival. The risk calculation had changed, but so had the potential intelligence value of deep penetration patrols that could observe enemy base areas without triggering massive security responses. Roberts selected an insertion point 12 kilometers northeast of Black Horse Base Camp in terrain that aerial reconnaissance had identified as a probable enemy rest area. The patrol would insert at 0230 hours instead of the previous 2300-hour insertions, taking advantage of the period when ambient jungle noise dropped to minimum levels and enemy security forces typically relaxed their vigilance. Each patrol member now carried the AN/PVS-2 Starlight scope, increasing night observation capability by 35% and allowing distributed surveillance of multiple approach routes. The January 20th insertion proceeded according to plan until 0130 hours. Roberts was moving point when his boot depressed a hidden pressure plate connected to a 105mm artillery shell buried beneath the trail. The explosion threw him backwards into Lieutenant Collins, both men stunned by the blast that echoed across the valley like thunder in the pre-dawn darkness. Shrapnel peppered the trees above their heads, and Roberts felt warm blood running down his left arm from multiple fragment wounds. Collins keyed the radio immediately, transmitting the brevity code for troops in contact. Bushmaster Base, Phantom 1, Broken Arrow, Grid 308427, immediate extraction required. The booby trap had been positioned perfectly, triggering when the patrol was deep in enemy territory with no supporting fires available and limited routes for withdrawal under contact. The enemy response came within minutes. Automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 directions as Viet Cong forces that had been waiting in prepared positions opened up on the patrol's location. Roberts realized with sickening clarity that his patrol had walked into a carefully prepared ambush. The enemy had anticipated silent insertion tactics and positioned forces to exploit the very stealth techniques that had proven so successful in Phuoc Tuy province. The patrol took cover behind a fallen mahogany log, while bullets chipped bark and whined overhead. Roberts counted muzzle flashes from at least 12 enemy weapons, indicating a force of squad size or larger in prepared defensive positions. Without gunship support or artillery on call, the patrol faced a tactical problem that silence and patience could not solve. They were pinned down in enemy territory with 1 wounded man and limited ammunition for a sustained firefight. Collins crawled to Roberts's position and shouted over the gunfire. 2 Hueys inbound. Estimated time of arrival 6 minutes. Cobra gunship scrambled from Black Horse. Estimated time 12 minutes. Roberts checked his watch and calculated movement time to the nearest extraction landing zone. 400 meters through terrain, the enemy knew better than his patrol did, with 1 wounded man slowing their movement speed. The helicopter extraction turned into a running firefight that lasted 2 hours. Enemy forces pursued the withdrawing patrol, calling in additional fighters who attempted to cut off routes to the landing zone. The first Huey took ground fire during its approach, forcing the pilot to abort the initial extraction attempt. Cobra gunships arrived and suppressed enemy positions with rockets and 20mm cannon fire, finally allowing the patrol to break contact and reach the landing zone at 0450 hours. Roberts sat in the medical bunker at Nui Dat 12 hours later, picking shrapnel fragments from his arm, while Colonel Anderson reviewed the after-action report. The conventional forces had been proven right, at least partially. When the enemy anticipated silent insertion tactics and prepared accordingly, stealth became a liability rather than an advantage. The mission had been aborted, 1 man wounded, and the patrol forced to rely on exactly the kind of heavy fire support that Roberts had been trying to eliminate from SASR operations. But Roberts was not ready to abandon the concept entirely. The failure in Long Con province revealed the limitations of silent insertion, but it also highlighted areas for tactical improvement. Later insertions at 0230 hours when enemy alertness dropped to minimum levels. Better reconnaissance of target areas to identify booby trap patterns. Most importantly, enhanced night vision equipment that would allow patrols to detect enemy preparations before walking into prepared ambush sites. Roberts spent the next 3 months refining the tactical procedures based on lessons learned in Long Con. The Starlight scopes provided 35% better target detection at ranges up to 800 meters. Modified insertion times reduced the probability of enemy detection during helicopter approach by an additional 18%. Most significantly, patrol signature continued to decrease as techniques improved, allowing SASR teams to operate closer to enemy positions without triggering security responses. The vindication came during a 7-day patrol in April. Roberts led his team 50 kilometers into enemy-controlled territory, established observation posts that recorded detailed intelligence on logistics operations, then conducted a coordinated ambush against a truck convoy carrying supplies from Cambodia. 7 vehicles destroyed with law rockets and satchel charges. 31 enemy casualties. 0 friendly losses. Extraction accomplished before enemy reinforcements could respond. The institutional resistance remained, however. American units continued to demand gunship escort for every operation beyond company perimeter. Australian conventional forces expressed skepticism about SASR methods that seemed to increase risk for marginal tactical advantage. Even within 2nd Squadron, some patrol leaders questioned whether silent insertion techniques justified the additional training requirements and operational complexity. The tragedy struck on the night of May 15, 1970. Roberts sat in the base support company bunker at Nui Dat, staring at the casualty report that had arrived via encrypted radio transmission 30 minutes earlier. A combined U.S.-Australian patrol had attempted to replicate his silent insertion tactics in the same Long Con province sector where his team had been ambushed 4 months earlier. The American platoon leader had read Roberts's after-action reports and convinced his company commander that night insertion without gunship cover represented the future of small unit operations in Vietnam. The patrol had inserted at 0200 hours via single Huey drop, following the modified timeline that Roberts had developed after his near disaster in January. 28 soldiers from Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, reinforced by 4 Australian advisors from the Army Training Team Vietnam. They carried starlight scopes and moved in patrol formation that mimicked SASR techniques, maintaining noise discipline and avoiding predictable movement patterns that had characterized previous operations in the area. The enemy had been waiting. Viet Cong forces had observed the modified insertion patterns during previous SASR operations and adapted their own tactical procedures accordingly. Instead of responding immediately to helicopter noise with defensive dispersal, they had learned to remain in position and track patrol movement using sound discipline that matched what the Australians had developed. The result was a coordinated ambush that caught the combined patrol in a kill zone at 0215 hours. Roberts read the casualty figures twice, hoping the numbers would change. 4 killed in action, 13 wounded in action. The American platoon leader and 1 Australian advisor among the dead. The patrol had broken contact only after calling in emergency gunship support, exactly the kind of noisy extraction that silent insertion tactics were designed to avoid. Worse yet, the enemy had anticipated the helicopter response and positioned anti-aircraft weapons that damaged 1 Huey and forced the others to abort their initial rescue attempts. Lieutenant Collins found Roberts still staring at the report 2 hours later. "The Yanks are calling it proof that night insertion doesn't work," Collins said, settling onto an ammunition crate that served as makeshift furniture in the bunker. Colonel Anderson received 3 separate radio calls from American commanders demanding that SASR discontinue autonomous operations and conform to standard air mobile doctrine. Roberts folded the casualty report and placed it in his notebook next to tactical diagrams and ammunition expenditure calculations from successful operations. The mathematics of small unit warfare had become brutally clear over 18 months of night operations. When SASR patrols used silent insertion techniques with proper training and terrain preparation, they achieved tactical effects that far exceeded conventional operations while sustaining minimal casualties. But when other units attempted to copy those techniques without adequate preparation, the results proved catastrophic. The fundamental problem was not tactical, but institutional. Silent insertion required months of specialized training in jungle movement, noise discipline, and night navigation techniques that conventional infantry units did not possess. It demanded familiarity with enemy tactics that came only from extended operations in specific terrain. Most importantly, it required acceptance of risk levels that contradicted everything American doctrine taught about force protection and overwhelming firepower superiority. Roberts opened his notebook and began writing what he knew would be his final after-action analysis. Successful night insertion depends on 3 factors that cannot be abbreviated or eliminated. First, patrol members must move through jungle terrain at speeds below 1 kilometer per hour for extended periods, requiring physical conditioning and navigation skills beyond standard infantry training. Second, enemy detection requires interpretation of sounds, movements, and terrain features that can only be learned through repeated exposure to combat conditions in specific geographical areas. Third, tactical patience must override conventional instincts to call for immediate fire support when contact appears imminent. The institutional backlash arrived within 48 hours. Roberts received orders to report to Colonel Anderson for what the message described as policy clarification regarding autonomous patrol operations. The operations bunker at Nui Dat buzzed with radio traffic from American commanders who wanted SASR patrols to conform to standardized insertion procedures that included gunship escort, artillery on standby, and predetermined extraction sites that could accommodate multiple helicopter landing zones. Anderson spread a tactical map across the briefing table and pointed to areas where recent operations had taken place. "Roberts, the Americans are pulling their support for autonomous operations. They want every patrol to follow standard air-mobile procedures. Helicopter insertion with gunship escort, artillery support on call, radio contact every 30 minutes. They're saying your methods work for highly trained special operations forces, but get people killed when regular infantry tries to copy them." Roberts studied the map and calculated the tactical implications of returning to conventional doctrine. Helicopter noise would alert enemy forces within 5 kilometers of insertion sites, forcing patrols to operate in terrain that had already been swept clean of significant targets. Radio contact every 30 minutes would require patrol leaders to establish communication schedules that the enemy could monitor and triangulate. Most significantly, gunship escort would eliminate the element of surprise that made small unit patrols effective against larger enemy forces. The final validation came from an unexpected source. In June, Roberts received a letter from a former Viet Cong prisoner who had been captured during one of his patrol's ambush operations in Phuoc Tuy province. The Saarca prisoner had been released as part of a routine exchange and had somehow obtained Roberts's unit address through South Vietnamese military channels. The letter, written in broken English with assistance from a translator, contained a single paragraph that Roberts would remember for the rest of his life. "We called your soldiers Ma Rung, which means ghosts of the jungle. When helicopters came, we knew where you would be and when you would arrive. We could prepare ambushes and escape routes because helicopters must land in clearings that we watched every day. But Ma Rung came from darkness without noise. We could not hear them or predict their movement. They appeared when we felt safe and disappeared before we could respond. This frightened us more than bombs or artillery because we could not understand how they moved through jungle that we knew better than our own villages." Roberts folded the letter and placed it in his notebook next to casualty reports and tactical diagrams. The enemy had confirmed what operational data had suggested for months. Silent insertion worked because it exploited enemy expectations about American tactical doctrine. When patrols arrived without helicopter noise, moved without radio chatter, and struck without preliminary bombardment, they achieved psychological effects that exceeded their actual combat power. But the broader system had not changed. American commanders continued to demand overwhelming firepower support for every operation. Australian conventional forces remained skeptical of techniques that seemed to increase risk without providing measurable advantage. Even within SASR, patrol leaders questioned whether specialized tactics justified the additional training time and operational complexity required for successful implementation. Roberts closed his notebook and walked outside the bunker into the humid evening air of Phuoc Tuy province. 2nd Squadron SASR would complete their final tour and withdraw from Vietnam in October of 1971. The institutional knowledge they had developed would return to Australia with them, leaving conventional forces to continue operations according to doctrine that emphasized firepower over stealth, noise over patience, and overwhelming force over tactical surprise. The transport aircraft lifted off from Tan Son Nhut Airfield on October 28, 1971, carrying the last elements of 2nd Squadron SASR back to Australia. Roberts pressed his face against the small window and watched the green expanse of Phuoc Tuy province disappear beneath scattered clouds. Somewhere down there, American and South Vietnamese forces continued operations according to doctrine that demanded gunship escort for every patrol beyond firebase perimeters. The institutional knowledge that SASR had developed over 4 years of night operations would cross the Pacific Ocean in the memories of 96 soldiers who had learned to hunt ghosts in the jungle darkness. The homecoming proved anticlimactic. Roberts found himself assigned to the Infantry Center at Singleton, New South Wales, where his primary responsibility involved teaching conventional tactics to officer candidates who would never serve in jungle environments. The tactical innovations that had proven so effective in Vietnam seemed irrelevant to exercises conducted on open training areas where helicopters could land anywhere, and radio communication remained crystal clear across distances measured in kilometers rather than meters. But the lessons lived on in unexpected ways. Captain Williams, a former SASR patrol leader who had served 2 tours in Phuoc Tuy province, established a night patrolling course at the Jungle Training Center in Canungra, Queensland. The curriculum incorporated silent movement techniques, noise discipline, and navigation skills that had been developed during Vietnam operations. Students learned to move through dense vegetation at speeds below 1 kilometer per hour, interpret sounds that revealed enemy activity, and conduct ambush operations without preliminary bombardment or immediate fire support. More significantly, Australian instructors began working with South Vietnamese forces, who faced the challenge of continuing operations after American withdrawal. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam had relied on U.S. helicopter support and artillery coverage for most tactical operations since 1965. As American forces departed, South Vietnamese commanders needed alternative methods for conducting patrol operations in terrain where the enemy held tactical advantage through familiarity and local support. Roberts received reports from instructors working with South Vietnamese Ranger battalions in the Mekong Delta. Vietnamese soldiers proved remarkably adaptable to silent insertion techniques that matched their physical size and cultural patience. They moved through jungle terrain with natural stealth that required months for Western soldiers to develop. Most importantly, they understood the tactical value of operations that avoided predictable patterns and overwhelming firepower signatures that announced military presence to entire provinces. The institutional resistance remained strong in Saigon, however. South Vietnamese commanders, who had been trained by American advisors, continued to demand helicopter support for every operation. They viewed silent insertion as a retreat from modern military capabilities rather than an evolution beyond conventional doctrine. The political pressure to maintain visible symbols of military power often overrode tactical considerations that favored stealth over showmanship. Roberts learned the ultimate validation of his methods through intelligence reports that reached Australia in late 1972. North Vietnamese documents captured during operations in Quang Tri Province contained tactical instructions that specifically addressed countermeasures against what they termed Ma Rung operations. Enemy forces had been ordered to establish listening posts around potential helicopter landing zones, monitor radio frequencies used by patrol forces, and respond to any helicopter activity with immediate defensive dispersal. But the same documents revealed North Vietnamese confusion about patrol tactics that avoided helicopter insertion. Enemy commanders complained that Ma Rung forces appeared in areas where no helicopter activity had been detected, struck targets without preliminary bombardment, and disappeared without using extraction helicopters that could be tracked and ambushed. The psychological effect had proven as important as tactical results, forcing enemy units to maintain constant security alertness that reduced their operational effectiveness. The final chapter of the Ma Rung story unfolded in Australia during the early 1980s when SASR began developing tactics for potential operations in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. Roberts, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, found himself commanding the counter-terrorist and special recovery teams that adapted Vietnam-era patrol techniques for operations in different terrain and political environments. The fundamental principles remained unchanged: small teams, minimal signatures, tactical patience, and effects that exceeded apparent capability. Roberts stood before a reunion gathering of 2nd Squadron veterans in Brisbane during October of 1988. 23 former patrol leaders had traveled from across Australia to commemorate the 20th anniversary of their first night insertion operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The informal gathering took place in a hotel conference room decorated with maps, photographs, and equipment displays that recreated the atmosphere of tactical planning sessions at Nui Dat Base Camp. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, now retired, presented statistical data that had been compiled from operational records spanning 4 years of SASR operations in Vietnam. Nearly 1,200 patrols conducted using night insertion techniques. 492 confirmed enemy casualties. Intelligence collected on enemy unit locations, movement patterns, and logistics operations that had influenced tactical decisions across 3 provinces. Most remarkably, SASR casualty rates during night operations had proven significantly lower than conventional forces conducting similar missions with helicopter and artillery support. Collins, now a major serving with 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, raised the question that had haunted everyone who had participated in the Ma Rung operations. What if we had been able to convince the Americans to adopt our methods on a larger scale? What if conventional forces had learned to operate without the helicopter umbrella that announced their presence across half of South Vietnam? Roberts considered the question that had no definitive answer. The institutional culture of American forces in Vietnam had been shaped by industrial capacity, technological superiority, and doctrinal assumptions that equated firepower with tactical effectiveness. Silent insertion techniques required acceptance of risk levels and training investments that contradicted fundamental beliefs about force protection and overwhelming superior capabilities. The reunion concluded with a ceremony at the Nui Dat Memorial in Brisbane, where Roberts placed a wreath commemorating soldiers from both sides who had died during night operations in Phuoc Toi Province. The memorial inscription read simply, "They moved through darkness to secure the peace." Roberts stood silently before the granite monument and reflected on tactical lessons that had proven both timeless and forgotten. The smallest force could achieve the greatest effect not by demanding the most firepower, but by accepting the discipline of silence. In an age of technological warfare and overwhelming capability, the ghosts of the jungle had demonstrated that patience remained more powerful than noise, stealth more effective than overwhelming force, and tactical innovation more decisive than conventional doctrine. The Marung had taught that victory belonged not to those who made the most noise, but to those who understood when silence itself became a weapon,